Okay, we're looking at tissues today, chapter 4, and basically there's 4 major tissues in the body. As you can see in the picture here, starting with nervous tissue. So some of the organs in nervous tissue are the brain, spinal cord, and then what comes off the spinal cord are nerves. Basically, the function of the nervous system is to control homeostasis. So you need to send signals to the brain like something is changing, and then the brain needs to communicate to targets in order to bring back what went out of homeostasis back into normal. So an example, let's say if you got hot, you send signals to the brain, it's hot, and you communicate to like sweat glands to produce sweat, so that way you can cool down. Another major tissue is muscle. Basically, there's 3 types of muscle. There's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle. And all muscle types will provide for some type of movement. So for skeletal muscle, that's the only one that you're consciously aware of controlling. And that one's for voluntary movement, communication, and when you're cold, it'll contract quickly in an attempt to produce heat. Another type muscle could be cardiac muscle. So the job of your heart is to pump blood. So that's what it's moving there. And then the third type muscle would be like smooth muscle. You can see you find in most often, not always, but most often in the walls of organs where you're going to be pushing a solid or liquid. You could start thinking like digestive organs, urinary organs, or even blood vessels. Another major tissue is epithelial tissue. You find this type tissue like making up the top layer of your skin. All the inner lining of organs, if there's a cavity, what makes up the walls of the cavity is epithelial tissue. And if you recollect your lab worksheet, what's called serous membranes that surround organs, they're also made up of epithelial tissue. The 4th major tissue type is connective tissue. That covers a wide range of different type tissues. Usually, if you have to categorize a tissue and you're not sure which major tissue it falls under, more likely it's going to fall under connective tissue. Some of the tissues do connect other tissues together, and some examples of connective tissue would be like blood, cartilage. Those are examples of connective tissue. Tendons, which is a muscle-to-bone connection, is connective tissue. A ligament, ligament's also connecting. What it connects is 2 bones together, and that is another example of connective tissue. Even adipose, you notice here on the bottom it says fat. So even adipose falls under that major tissue type, connective. And all connective tissue is going to derive from an embryonic tissue that comes from the embryo called mesenchyme, and then it deviates into the different types of connective tissue. Now, when you're trying to name epithelial tissue, the way they name it is they first look at the amount of layers. Basically, if it's only one layer, you're going to see within the name of the tissue simple, indicating only one layer. If you got multiple layers for the tissue, you'll see within its name it says stratified. Regardless, both simple and stratified will have a basal layer and then the top layer that called it apical surface. You see the next picture here. So simple, one layer, stratified, multi-layer. So if you start thinking stratified, you'd want that in areas for protection. So like the top layer of your skin, any orifice or exiting of the body, like the oral cavity, would be stratified. Simple, one layer, you don't necessarily need protection, so you find that deeper in the body. And if it's only one layer, the advantage there is going to allow things to quickly move from one area to another, which is simple diffusion. So if you think of like in the lungs and the little air sacs where you need to upload oxygen, the lining of those little air sacs is going to be made up of one layer of epithelial tissue. Other areas would be like your smallest blood vessels called capillaries, where you're going to provide oxygen and nutrients to tissue. those capillaries are basically made up of one layer, which is simple. Once you identified whether it's one or many layers, um, you're going to see also within naming a epithelial tissue, the shape of the cells. So if the shape of the cells at the top layer is flat, you would refer to it within its name squamous. However, if it looks cube-like, then you refer to within the name cuboidal. And last, if it looks like a column, well, then you refer to the name of that epithelial tissue as columnar. So here you're looking at a drawing on the top left of simple, which means one layer, squamous, meaning flat, and epithelial tissue, because that's the type of tissue it is. So again, how do you decipher, let's say, one cell from the next? Typically look for what's in the middle, the nucleus, and that takes up the most stain. Normally cells don't come colored under the microscope. They have to be applied with a stain. And what takes up the most stain are the chromosomes located within the nucleus. So this is one layer. I identify the individual cells by looking at the nucleus, and it's flat. So you see how they named this tissue. It's named simple squamous epithelial tissue. So this one they cut into these little air sacs in the lungs, and then they put it on a flat slide, and therefore it looks kind of flat here. You're looking at it from a superior view, looking at it from above. And typically, normally, the little darker dots indicate where the cell's nucleus are located. And what is the advantage here? Well, diffusion can occur faster. So if you're in the lungs, you need to upload oxygen quickly and also get it into your bloodstream. So that would be the advantage. If you find this in the capillaries, making up the lining of a capillary, you're going to be able to upload oxygen quickly and download it to tissues quickly. Okay, let's look at the drawing first. On the top left, it looks like it's one layer. Again, I'm looking at the individual cells, nuclei, and the shape of the cell looks to be cube-like. So you refer to naming this type of tissue as simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. So if anytime you see the cube shape here, this type of cell is going to be doing one or two things or both, depending on the location of the body. Secretion, in other words, it's making something, the cell, and it secretes it, or absorption. So let's give an example. It says here in the kidneys, there's some also glands. They're going to secrete products, and it's going to be excreted out of the cell. Now, when you look at the actual slide, the little dark little regions, again, those are the cell's nucleus. And think of I guess, a tube. And in the middle of the tube, there's the cavity we call the lumen. And what makes up the lining of the tube is this type tissue. It's one layer and cells are cube-like in shape. And it looks like there's multiple ducts or slash tubes. So this duct slash tube, these cells would probably be making some sort of product and excreting it out where it travels through the cavity, the duct, D-U-C-T, duct. It's a fancy name for tube. Looking at the drawing first, it looks like, again, one layer, so it's still simple within its name. And the shape of the cells is column-like, so they named this tissue simple columnar epithelial tissue. And again, just like cuboidal, depending on the location of the body, these type of cells will be doing one or two things or both, secreting something or doing some absorption. So secreting maybe like mucus or maybe some enzymes. And in this case, they have microvilli, which makes the cell better at absorption. So like think of your digestive organs, most absorption occurs in the small intestine. So the inner lining of the small intestine, you'll see these type of tissue here making up the lining. It's one layer, simple columnar epithelial tissue. You may even describe it further, indicating that it has microvilli. And again, microvilli is extensions of the cell membrane. It increases surface area so that the cell's better at absorption. Some other things you may notice here, you got a mucus cell or goblet cell making mucus. It's also going to be secreted out of these cells. Now, looking at the picture, the drawing, well, it looks like it's many layers, but typically these cells are squeezed in between each other. So technically, it's still one layer. So it may look like it's layered. So they say it's falsely layered. And therefore, the word for false is pseudo, and layered is stratified. So this is falsely layered, which means pseudo stratified. And the shape of the cell is columnar. So you name this type tissue pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. In this here in the actual slide, if you look to the right, it actually has these little protein projections embedded in the membrane called cilia. And cilia is going to help propel substances like mucus that goblet cells would make. So if you think of where you may find this type of tissue inside your trachea, where there's the cavity called the lumen, what makes up the walls of the lumen is this type tissue. You have cilia, and then you have the cells that make mucus. Mucus helps to trap particles so that nothing goes further down within the lungs. And then the cilia help to propel it so you can like cough it out or swallow it, which would go down to your stomach. Again, this here is called pseudostratified, and I can even name it further, ciliated, indicating it has cilia, columnar epithelial tissue. All right, I'll look at the drawing first. On the top left, it looks like it's multi-layer, so I know it's going to have within its name stratified. When you take the shape of the cells, always look at the top surface called the apical surface for deciphering the shape of the cell. Because at the top layer, the cell is flat, it's dead for protection. And then toward the basal layer, these cells here are still alive. They're doing mitosis. And you recollect, what was it, chapter 3? The purpose of mitosis is for growth or repair. So this tissue here you find where you need protection. So think of like the top layer of your skin, anywhere where friction occurs, like leaving the body, like your oral cavity or the anal canal. Near the exits, you're going to find this type tissue. It's called stratified, and the shape of the cell, squamous epithelial tissue. Now, when you start looking at tissue, start noticing if you see any blood vessels within the tissue. If you don't see blood vessels within the tissue, it's often referred to as avascular. Avascular means without blood vessels. So these cells in the basal layer that are doing mitosis, they do need oxygen, they do need nutrients in order to do mitosis. So through diffusion, the next type tissue down, connective tissue, there'd be some blood vessels there that would provide oxygen and nutrients to the cells that are doing mitosis. And let's see the picture down here. You can see in the oral cavity, you need protection anywhere where friction occurs. So the lining of like your oral cavity, top layer of your skin, you'd find this type tissue, stratified, squamous, epithelial tissue. Okay, yeah, we need to be careful with trying to name this type tissue. I know I look at the drawing, and when I was a student, I'm tempted to automatically say stratified. And then I look at the top layer to indicate the shape of the cells. They're cube-like. So normally you may be tempted to say stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue. And yet the book here wants us to know it as transitional epithelial tissue. What do they mean by transition? Well, typically you find this type tissue within the walls of organs where they store contents will kind of expand out. And then when you relieve the contents within the organ, it transitions back to its shape. So think of like your bladder, where you store liquid waste. The inner cavity that makes the tissue there is going to be this type. It's called transitional epithelial tissue. So here you can see in the bottom of the picture, the bladder, the inner cavity would be made up of this type tissue. Also, within the connection of the kidneys to the bladder, within the lumen, which is the cavity, you'll find, again, this type tissue, transitional. And then exiting the bladder, called the urethra, you'd find this type tissue, transitional. However, once you're exiting the urethra, any orifice where friction occurs, then it's going to switch to this type tissue, stratified and squamous for protection. One other thing I want to bring to your attention as far as stratified squamous, you may be thinking, well, why are these cells up top flat? And why are these in the basal layer cube-like in shape? Well, the ones that are doing mitosis are still alive. They're getting oxygen and nutrients from blood vessels below, located in the connective tissue. Now, as the cells get older, they get pushed further up top, they get cut off from oxygen and nutrients, and they die. They flatten out. No longer are they there alive, but they are providing protection. So if you think of anytime we have more friction occur, like say on your skin, you'll start to form more calluses. Well, that is pretty much dead cells, and that is providing for protection. All right, let's skip down. We already did this one, transitional epithelial tissue. This picture is just showing us some cells that pretty much make mucus, milk excreted out. Just depends on the body what the mucus is for. Typically, it could be in the trachea, your windpipe, to trap particles so they don't go further down from gas exchange. You may have these type of cells in the stomach where they make a buffer type mucus to protect the lining from the acidity of the stomach. So it just depends on the location. And this cell happens to have a little bit of microvilli, so I mean probably some small intestine doing absorption as well. Okay, now we're going to look at glands. Glands are made up of epithelial tissue. The majority, like 99% of glands, are epithelial tissue. Okay. And let me see if we get to a larger picture. And it's about the same. So here you're going to find a tube that we refer to as a duct within the gland. And then these cells, they're cube-like in shape. It's one layer, so it's simple cuboidal. It's epithelial tissue. So these cells are going to secrete some product. It's going to travel through the duct, which is the cavity, and then it's going to exit the body through a pore. So these type glands, they may name them by the shape. So it's one layer, it's simple. It's not too complex. And look at the shape here, the gland, it's tubular. This one looks like there's tubular still, but multiple branches. So it's simple branch tubular. And then they give some examples here. They say intestinal glands or stomach glands. Down here, you still got a duct, which is the tube, and a gland here. No longer at the bottom does it look tubular. It looks round. So the word for round is alveolar. So this one on the left, simple alveolar. And then to the one on the right, looks like it branches out a little, would be simple branched alveolar. And all these glands, if they make what's called a product and it travels through a duct, which is a tube, they're all types of what we call exocrine gland, Exocrine. Exocrine, like they're going to excrete something. So think of like sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands. Those are examples of exocrine glands. Don't get these glands confused with glands that make hormones. Those glands that make hormones are called endocrine glands, Endocrine. Endocrine. Endo means within. They're secreting hormones that travel in your bloodstream that when they get to a target are involved in homeostasis. The ones you're looking at here are exocrine glands, Exocrine. Okay, these look a little more complex. These are called compound tubular. Okay, so not only do you have branches, it's multiple of them, and yet the duct, the tube, is still tube-like, so it's tubular in its name. These here look compound as well, but now look at the shape, it's round, so it's alveolar. Some examples of these would be, it says mammary glands. The ones on the top that I forgot to mention says glands of the small intestine. And then this one has a combination of round and tube-like, so this one's compound tubulo-alveolar. And these examples are salivary glands. Listen, you don't need to know each type of glands according to their shape. What you need to get out of this is that these glands, they make a product, it travels through a duct. In general, they're called exocrine glands. Examples: sweat glands, oil glands, salivary glands, or exocrine glands. Now, these exocrine glands, when they secrete what they make, they can do it one of two ways. You notice on the left, they can simply excrete what they make through the process called exocytosis, and the cell's still alive to repeat the process. So these type of glands that survive the process go under a category more specifically called merocrine glands, MEROCRINE. So these type, think of as an example, would be like salivary glands, sweat glands. Now, if you look at the right, look at these glands here in the basal layer. They're doing mitosis. And you can tell the stage here. You see a little cleavage furrow. This mitosis is in telophase stage. But anyway, we're getting away from the subject here. These glands, they secrete their product, but they burst, they lyse. In other words, they sacrifice themselves as they release the product. So they're pretty much dead. And so examples of these type of glands where they lyse to secrete what they make, think of oil glands. And in that case, they go under a category more specifically called holocrine glands. All right, we did that. All right, let's go on. We're leaving epithelial tissue, which is one of the major tissue types. Another major tissue type, and remember, there's four. In this case, we're looking at connective tissue. All connective tissue comes from an embryonic tissue called mesenchyme, and then it differentiates into different type tissues. So this basically, you're looking at one type of connective tissue. If the matrix, in other words, what makes up the tissue is not tightly compact, you're more likely going to see in its name loose, indicating it's not very densely compact. And this type of tissue, let me see here, did they name it? Let me see, they have another, it's loose areolar connective tissue. So this is the drawing, and then when the next slide, this is the actual, what you would see under the microscope. Now, every connective tissue is what it's going to have is a matrix component, and depending on the tissue, fiber types. Now, the matrix is just anything non-living. It may be something that's stored in that tissue. Anything non-living does not have the ability to replicate. So typically, like these cells have the ability to replicate, that's not part of what's called the matrix. Matrix is anything non-living, and fiber types. Fibers are what you see here to connect tissues together. So the strongest fiber type to connect other tissues together, that one's called collagen fiber. So like if you have a muscle to bone connection, you would be using this type fiber to connect the muscle to the bone. Another fiber type you may see in connective tissue is elastic fiber. This one in brown is the most pliable. So if you think of like the cartilage in your ear, which is elastic cartilage, has this type fiber, elastic, the most pliable. And then not too strong, yet not too pliable, something in between the two is called reticular fiber. So in blue here is reticular fiber. So basically you find this type tissue like connecting your top layer of the skin to deeper structures like your muscles. This will be found in, well, it's called connective tissue, but the type is loose areolar. Some things you may see in tissues, cells. So what makes up these fibers? Collagen, elastic, reticular would be a cell, fibroblast. Typically, if a cell ends in blast, tells me the cell's immature. When it ends in cyte, which means cell, then it's mature. You may see some white blood cells in tissues. White blood cells, red blood cells are produced in bone marrow. They do enter your bloodstream, where red blood cells should stay in there in the bloodstream unless you're bleeding. And white blood cells typically squeeze their way out of blood vessels, and they do their job in tissues. And their job is to look for anything foreign to get rid of. So some examples of some white blood cells here may be a macrophage, kind of acts like an amoeba, so that when it encounters something, it'll phagocytize it. Another type white blood cell here is called a lymphocyte. A mast cell is another type white blood cell, and so is this neutrophil. You may see some adipose tissue, fat cells within other tissues. So here you see some fat cells, which stores lipids as a fuel reserve. And if the tissue is vascular, you'll see some blood vessels. And the smallest blood vessels that download oxygen nutrients to your cells and uptake the tissue's waste products are called capillaries. So in this tissue, you see a capillary. All right, so this is the drawing of what's called loose areolar connective tissue. It's one type of connective tissue. And then in this slide, you can see this picture here. This is what you'll be seeing under the microscope. So come Tuesday, when you have lab, or whenever day your lab occurs, you'll get to a microscope. You'll have the opportunity to see the different tissue types. And basically, this type tissue connects epithelial tissue to deeper tissues within the body. So let's think of like the top layer of your skin. This tissue will connect to deeper tissues in the body. Or if you're in a cavity within an organ, maybe a digestive organ, it's connecting the epithelial tissue within the organ to deeper structures in the body as well. The function of this tissue, you can read here, it says it wraps, cushions organs. If there's white blood cells within it, like macrophages, they're there to get rid of things foreign by phagocytizing, maybe if it's a bacteria. Plays an important role to absorb inflammation. So when you have damage to any part of the body, blood vessels there typically leak more fluid out. And like a napkin, this type tissue will absorb it. Kind of seals off the area, so if there's anything foreign like bacteria, it doesn't spread easily. Okay, another type connective tissue is adipose tissue. Yes, it's connective tissue. It has a matrix, which is non-living. Basically, the fat, it's non-living. And the function of adipose tissue, the main function is a fuel reserve. Your body can take any nutrient, whether it's a sugar or an amino acid, and as long as you have extra than what your body needs, it can convert it into fat and store it in your fat cells. Another function of adipose tissue, if it surrounds a particular organ, may provide for some absorption, so it gives protection. And if it's around the eyes, it prevents like heat leaving the eye cavity. Okay, so those are some of the functions, and depending male or female, female tend to store adipose more like in the breast and hips versus males more like in the abdomen. Oh, one other thing I failed to mention, if you look at the actual picture here, what you would see under the microscope, you got to remember nothing comes colored. It's always stained. So if it's a different color, well, they use a different colored stain. Okay. You're probably wondering these little dots here, what are those? Those are the cell's nucleus. Normally nucleuses are in the middle of a cell, but as the adipose cell stores lipid, fat, it pushes the nucleus to the side, therefore explaining why you don't see the nucleus in the middle. All right, another type of connective tissue here is called loose, reticular connective tissue. So in other words, the type of fibers that you see in this type tissue are reticular. You find this within your lymphatic organs, in this case, like your spleen, also your lymph nodes. If you remember, recollect, what was it? Chapter 1, one of the functions of your lymphatic system is to provide an ideal site for white blood cells to look for anything foreign and filter the fluid going within those lymphatic structures. So here you can see they point out a white blood cell, and then the fiber types are reticular. And let me just bring out what's the function of your spleen. The function of your spleen here is to break down old red blood cells and also allow for white blood cells to proliferate, which means to copy themselves so you end up with more. Okay, so let me read the function here. Fibers form a soft internal skeleton that support other cell types. In other words, provides an ideal site for white blood cells to look for anything foreign. Now, the previous connective tissues we saw were loose, meaning the medium, which is the matrix, it's not tightly compact. And again, let me bring to your attention, what's the matrix? Anything non-living, which means they call it ground substance. It can maybe proteins, minerals, that goes under what's called ground substance, and fiber types. And try to recollect the 3 fiber types you may see in connective tissue. Maybe the strongest type, collagen, maybe elastic, also reticular, or maybe a combination of the 3, just depending on which connective tissue you're looking at. So like think of your top layer of the skin is connected to deeper structures. You'd have pretty much all 3 fiber types securing your top layer of your skin to deeper muscle. All right, now we're getting out of the loose connective tissue, and now we're looking at the medium, the matrix here, where it's tightly condensed. And these fiber types are collagen fibers, and collagen fibers are the most resistant. And let me just show you, if they go in one direction, like I'm moving this arrow across, those fibers, the collagen fibers are going in one direction, which means they can only resist pull in one direction. So where do you find this type of tissue? Well, first of all, let's name it. It's, what does it say up top? Dense connective tissue, but it says dense regular. Regular means the fibers are going in one direction. That means they can only resist pull in one direction. So let's have a look. You find this in the tendon. So this is the tissue here that makes a tendon. Well, what's a tendon connecting? It's connecting a muscle to a bone. You'd have dense, regular connective tissue. You'd also find dense, regular connective tissue making up a ligament. A ligament is connecting a bone to bone. The other thing I want to bring to your attention as far as this tissue goes, it is poorly vascular, which means there are blood vessels, but not a lot. So if we ever have a slight tear in a tendon or ligament, healing is going to occur slowly because the tissue is poorly vascular, not too many blood vessels. Now, should you rupture, in other words, tear the tendon or ligament, that's not going to heal. You would need some type of surgery to repair a torn tendon or ligament. All right, let's go to the next picture. It's going to be somewhat similar, but the fibers are going to be arranged in many directions, not just one. And again, doesn't look pink like the previous picture because they used a different color stain. So it's still dense, which means the medium, the matrix, is tightly compact, but now the fiber types are in many directions. So instead of dense regular indicating one direction, we say dense irregular indicating many directions. So this is to resist pull in many directions. And the fiber type here is collagen fiber, which is the strongest. So you find this making up what's called joint capsules. A joint basically is where 2 bones meet. And typically your joints, for the majority, they allow movement. So if you think of like your shoulder joint, you got a capsule and you can move your arm in many directions. And what helps keep it in place is this joint capsule, which is made up of this connective tissue and therefore is properly named dense because it's tightly compact, irregular because the collagen fibers are arranged in many directions. So this is called dense, irregular connective tissue. And again, this tissue, just like the previous one, is poorly vascular, which means you don't have too many blood vessels, but there are some. So if you have a slight tear, it'll heal, but it'll take a long time. Now, if you totally rupture it or tear it a good amount, yeah, you need surgery to repair that. Okay, we're still looking at connective tissue. It is dense, which means it's tightly compact. So this one's called dense elastic connective tissue because the fiber types are very pliable. They're the elastic ones. So these vessels that leave the heart, the aorta, you think of when the heart contracts, blood's being pushed through the aorta, it's going to be expanding outward. And then when the heart relaxes, the vessel, the aorta, has to have the ability to recoil. So this tissue, the elastic fibers, allow the vessel to recoil. So within the walls of the aorta, you find this type tissue called dense elastic connective tissue. All right, cartilage. Cartilage is another type connective tissue. Basically, there's three types of cartilage in the body. The most abundant type is this type called hyaline cartilage. It's somewhat rigid, but not nearly as rigid as, let's say, your bone. So it gives shape to wherever you find it, to the organ that you find it within, and yet it's somewhat pliable. So you find this like in your trachea, your windpipe. It helps keep the airway open. You also find it lining your sternum to your rib cage. So that way when you breathe in, it allows your rib cage to expand out. And again, the function is to allow a little bit of rigidity and yet be somewhat pliable. Also, you find this like in the tip of your nose and the end of your long bones. So the cells that make the cartilage, they're called chondrocytes. And when they get trapped within the cartilage themselves, that little space to get trapped in within the cartilage, the space is called a lacuna. So you got a chondrocyte within a lacuna. And again, the little dark sphere is the nucleus of the cell. It takes up the most stain. Okay, the least abundant type cartilage is elastic. It's the most pliable. So the fiber types here are going to be the elastic fibers. You only find this in two areas, and the ear is one area, and the other is called the epiglottis. This structure called the epiglottis, it basically prevents solids and liquids going down your windpipe, which is your trachea. That epiglottis is made up of elastic cartilage. And again, the cells are called chondrocytes. And when they get trapped in the cartilage, the space they're trapped in, it's called a lacuna. One thing I want to bring to your attention about cartilage, you don't have blood vessels in there. It's avascular, which means without blood vessels. So these cells are going to get their oxygen and nutrients from surrounding tissues through diffusion. Diffusion, you recollect from last chapter, is when substances just go where there's a lot to where there's less. Now, since cartilage is avascular, should you damage it as an adult, this type of tissue is not likely to regenerate. You're likely to form what's called scar tissue, which means you're putting down collagen fibers, which are not very pliable. Now, the third type of cartilage in the body is fibrocartilage. So again, the cells are called chondrocytes. The space they're trapped within is called a lacuna. The fiber types are collagen, not necessarily to resist pull, but in this case, they stack the fibers on top of each other so that the tissue here can absorb compression. So you find fibrocartilage making up the disc in between your vertebrae so that you can absorb compression. Another area you find fibrocartilage is within the knee to absorb compression, and also between your what we call coxal bones that you know as your kind of your hip bones. In the front is a padding called the pubic symphysis, which is also this type cartilage, fibrocartilage. All right, bone. Bone also falls under connective tissue. And just to tell you, bone is very well vascular. You would think because bone's rigid, you may think there's no blood vessels in there, but there is. So what you're looking at the drawing on the bottom here is a long bone, which is the humerus in your upper part of the arm. Now, if you were going to do let me think, a coronal or frontal cut on the bone, you'd basically find a cavity within the shaft of the bone, and then all around the diameter, along the sides of the shaft of the bone, is this type in the actual microscope view is called compact bone. And you're probably going to see, you will see these little circular structures, kind of looks like a tree that's been cut across. Those circular structures are referred to as osteons, which is the basic unit, or we say functional unit of bone. The little black sphere in the middle, that's not a cell nucleus. No, that there is well, it's a cavity we call the central canal, and that's where blood vessels and nerves would be going through the bone. Surrounding each of these central canals, what look like smaller little dark regions, that's where you find the bone cell trapped within the bone. So the bone cells are called osteocytes. And again, when they get trapped within the bone, just like in cartilage, that space is called a lacuna. And within the bone, you may see slight little lines here indicating canals so that the cells can get their oxygen and nutrients through diffusion from the blood vessels going through the central canal. The ring patterns that make up the osteon, they're referred to as lamella. And again, bone's very well vascular. All right, blood. Blood's a connective tissue. The only thing with blood that you don't see in other tissues, as far as connective goes, you don't see fiber types. So, what exactly is the matrix of blood? What's non-living here? Gases, nutrients, minerals, electrolytes, hormones, all that makes up the matrix of blood. And the function of blood, it's a transport mechanism. What's traveling in the blood are hormones, nutrients, minerals, electrolytes, and gases, and white blood cells. So right now in the microscope view here to the right, you see these little kind of look like donuts, but what it is these are red blood cells and they lack a nucleus. Red blood cells, when they're being produced in bone marrow, they kick out their nucleus. And their job of the red blood cells to carry oxygen to tissues. These other cells, their nucleus don't look similar, but these are two different types of white blood cells. The one on top is a lymphocyte, which is very important for our immune system, which means resistance to disease. And then down below here is another type of white blood cell called a neutrophil, which typically fight against bacteria. Now, I just want to bring to your attention the drawing here. You're looking at an organ. Recollect in chapter 1, what's an organ? An organ's two or more tissues performing a function. So it is a capillary here. And what type tissue makes up the wall of the capillary is epithelial. It is one layer, which is simple, and the shape of the cell is flat. So the capillary wall is simple, squamous, epithelial tissue. However, the blood and other type tissues within the capillary, that is connective tissue. One thing I forgot to mention about the bone, if you're going to ask what's the matrix, what's the non-living component of bone, basically you could store like minerals within bone, like calcium and phosphorus. That would be part of its matrix. Also, the fiber types you find in bone are, you can't see it here, but there are collagen fibers to resist stress that's put onto your bone. Okay, now we're leaving connective tissue. Now we're looking at another major tissue type, which is muscle. There's three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. All three are going to provide for some form of movement. What we are looking at is skeletal muscle. Looking at the drawing, it has many nuclei. We refer to that as multinucleated. What explains that is when you develop it as an embryo / fetus, you have single cells connect to each other, and then it makes one long muscle cell. And in this drawing, as well as in the microscope view, you don't even get to see the whole cell. It's so long. And it's multinucleated, indicating the cell has many nuclei. You also see these little bands where it's darker and lighter. They're referred to as striations. What gives the appearance of striations are the proteins and how they're arranged inside the muscle. Okay, so for skeletal muscle, the location is attached to your bones. The function is for voluntary movement, communication. In times where you're hot, times where you're cold, It'll contract quickly to produce heat. And also facial expressions. So that is the function of your skeletal muscle. All right, cardiac muscle, it also provides movement, but what's it moving? Blood. This muscle you find within the walls of the heart. Okay, remember the heart's an organ. You got multiple tissues, but within the walls, you find this muscle, cardiac muscle. Typically, usually you're going to see there's one nuclei per cell, but somewhere in the reading, it usually says there's one or two nuclei per cell. You do still have striations, these stripe appearances. They're just not as, how can I say, they're not as easily seen as you saw in the previous muscle, like skeletal muscle. You have these regions here called intercalated discs. These are within here proteins that bind cells together so that excitation can quickly spread from one muscle cell to the other. So again, cardiac muscle's function is to propel blood. And where do you find it? Within the walls of the heart. All right, we're looking now at the third type muscle, which is smooth muscle. You don't quite rarely see striations. You only got one nuclei per cell. The cells tend to taper at the end, which means they come to a fine point. And most often, not always, but majority of the time, you find smooth muscle within organs where you're going to be pushing a solid or a liquid. So an example here, your digestive organs within the walls is smooth muscle. Within your bladder, we store liquid waste and you need to propel it out. Within the walls, you'll find smooth muscle. Within blood vessels, within their walls, you'll find smooth muscle. And the function is to push contents through the organ. Okay, I guess the last type, major tissue here is nervous tissue. The function of the nervous system is to maintain homeostasis. You need to control your internal environment, things like body temperature, blood pH, mineral levels, sugar levels, gas levels, etc. They can't go too far right or left, otherwise you can't maintain life. So in other words, if something deviates, let's say temperature, you need to send signals to the brain, and then the brain needs to communicate to targets to control body temperature. Right? So the way you send signals up to the brain are through nerve cells called neurons. Typically, let's look at the drawing first. Typically, here's the cell body of a neuron. These little branches are called dendrites, where other neurons can communicate to this neuron by releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters. And then this neuron, as well as others, they have a tail called an axon. And at the end of the axon, they may release neurotransmitters themselves to communicate to targets. The three main targets your brain can communicate to: muscle, whether it's skeletal, cardiac, or smooth. The other thing you may communicate to are glands, whether they're endocrine glands that make hormones or exocrine glands, which makes a product traveling through a duct. And the third thing you may be able to communicate to are other neurons. Now, looking at the slide here at the microscope view, kind of looks like a manta ray. It's kind of triangular in shape. That's the cell body. What looks like this like yellow in the middle, that's the nucleus. And then the little squiggly lines, the axon. What you can't really decipher here are the dendrites, but it does have dendrites. And these are neurons. Some organs of the nervous system include the brain, the spinal cord, and what comes out the spinal cord is what's called nerves. All right, this here, they're going to show us what in general is called membranes that are made from epithelial tissue. So let me get to the larger picture. This is called in general, your skin, the cutaneous membrane. And what type, and let me just bring to your attention, your skin is the largest organ in the body. What makes up the lining of your skin? In other words, what type tissue? It is epithelial. If you look at the top layer, friction occurs. So it'd be stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Now, all the inner lining of your organs, the walls within the organ are made up of epithelial tissue. So altogether, it's referred to as mucous membranes. Well, yeah, a lot of this tissue, they have cells, goblet cells that make mucus. One is to keep your inner organs moist because we live in a dry environment and these organs eventually lead to the outside, right? Like the oral cavity. The other thing here is mucus may help to trap particles so they don't go further down in the lungs. But again, all together, it's all epithelial tissue. If you're in the oral cavity, it'd be stratified squamous. If you're in the lungs where gas exchange occurs, that is epithelial tissue. That would be simple squamous. So depending on the location you're at, it may have multi-layers. Well, typically one layer. Multi-layers is like on the skin, but the shape of the cells would change according to which organ you're within and what's the function within that area. And again, altogether, it's referred to as mucous membranes. All right, this was in one of your lab worksheets. Let me recollect. I believe it was lab worksheet 1. This is epithelial tissue, and they make up membranes called serosa membranes for plural, or you say serous membranes for singular. So the serosa membrane or serous membrane around the heart, it is epithelial tissue. It's called the pericardium. It is 2 layers. If it physically touches the organ, it gets the pre-word visceral. And then if that backfolds onto the cavity housing the organ, it gets the pre-word parietal. And then you say the membrane's name, which is pericardium. The serous membrane around the lung is called the pleura. Again, if it physically touches the lung, it's deeper, gets the word visceral. If it backfolds onto the cavity housing the lung, it's more superficial, gets the pre-word parietal, and then there's the membrane name, pleura. The serous membrane around the digestive organs, it's called the peritoneum. Physically touching the organs, you refer to it as visceral peritoneum. Lining the cavity housing your organs, you refer to that part of the membrane as parietal peritoneum. All right, let's look here at the skin. See if I can take one picture at a time. The very top layer, well, let's first of all, your skin's an organ, okay? Organs, recollect, is 2 or more tissues doing a specific function. So the top layer of the skin, it's epithelial. It's multi-layered, so it's stratified. The shape of the cells at the top is flat. So we refer to it as stratified squamous epithelial tissue. I don't see blood vessels in the top layer, so we say it's avascular. The next layer is connective tissue. What type? It's called loose areolar connective tissue. It does have blood vessels in here. So through diffusion, that's going to provide oxygen and nutrients to the basal layer of the epithelial tissue. And then the third layer down, typically not really considered part of your skin, but sometimes they'll mention it, is the area where there's lipids called the hypodermis. And that type tissue as well, whereas adipose tissue is connective. Anyway, let's look at the picture. Let's say damage occurs. Some tissues have the ability to regenerate, to do mitosis. Not all tissues, okay? So the top layer, where the damage occurs, will be able to regenerate. The area where the damage occurs, chemicals will be released, and that'll cause blood vessels to open up more. So they're going to leak out more, causing inflammation. When they leak, the flow within the vessel slows down. That'll allow for white blood cells to get out and do their job. They'll be attracted to the chemicals to where they're needed. So therefore, if there's anything foreign, hopefully they get rid of it. Okay, so they get rid of it. Let's say the white blood cells get rid of anything foreign. Now's the time to do repair. The top layer, as long as the basal layer is somewhat intact, it's going to do mitosis and you'll have the exact same type tissue up top. Now, the connective tissue in the middle layer called the dermis, you have 3 there's fibers there. You have collagen fibers to resist pull, and then you have elastic fibers, somewhat pliable. Unfortunately, you're going to put more collagen fibers down in that area. and forming what's called scar tissue. So it may not be as pliable. So at the end, after healing occurs, the top layer, which is epithelial tissue, regenerates. The dermal layer, that area of connective tissue, you tend to put more collagen fibers down instead of elastic. Therefore, it's not as pliable. Therefore, it's called scar tissue. This last picture is showing the three layers that you'll see in the embryo, which form every tissue in the body. There's in blue what's called ectoderm. In red is referred to as mesoderm, and then in yellow is referred to as endoderm. When it comes to your skin is derived from all these three types of tissue: ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. Typically, I tell students ectoderm, think of it forms your nervous system, whereas the endoderm in yellow form the inner lining of your organs where there's a cavity, and the majority of tissue comes from the middle, called mesoderm. This is just a review of connective tissue, the types. You may have loose areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, also loose reticular connective tissue. If it's not loose, then it's dense. If the fibers go in one direction, it's dense regular. Many directions, dense irregular. If it's dense but it has elastic fibers, well, that's dense elastic. Cartilage is also an example of connective tissue. The three types: number one, the most abundant is hyaline. The least abundant is the elastic. And then to absorb compression is the fibrocartilage. The cells that make up cartilage, in general, they're called chondroblasts. When they get trapped within the matrix, in other words, within the cartilage, they're now mature. You refer to them as chondrocytes. Bone is also connective tissue. Don't forget, bone is very well vascular. However, cartilage is what? Avascular, without blood vessels. So the bone's tightly compact. It's referred to as compact bone. When you get to the next chapter, you're going to see areas where it may look like a sponge, where there's pockets. That type of bone is called spongy bone. The cells, if they're immature, they're referred to as osteoblasts. And then when they get trapped within the bone, they're mature. You refer to them as osteocytes. The fiber types in bone to resist stress: collagen. In blood is a connective tissue. The only thing with blood is you don't see fiber types. What makes up the matrix of blood? Anything non-living: gases, nutrients, minerals, electrolytes, etc. So connective tissues, the one that doesn't have fibers is the blood. Last but not least, how do you know when something's cancerous? Well, for something to be considered cancerous, the tissue has to copy itself, one, incorrectly. But to be considered cancer, it has to also have the ability to spread. Here you're looking at a polyp, which is kind of copying itself incorrectly, but yet it doesn't have the ability to spread just yet. So if it's non-life threatening, they refer to it as benign. Now, should this polyp rupture where the cells or tissues copying itself incorrectly, it now has the ability to spread. Therefore, we say that may be life-threatening, and the term for life-threatening is malignant. There's different treatments for cancer. Typically, the book talks about what chemotherapy, where you give a type of radioactive nutrient to your cells where they all take it up, and hopefully the cancer cells take up the most, so that way they all die and what you're left over is with good cells. But regardless, if you're giving a radioactive nutrient to cells, all of them are going to uptake it. However, cancer cells take up nutrients faster. The other type of therapy may be radiation, where they apply some type of like beam or whatnot, but it's more localized, doesn't treat all the cells of the body. Regardless, that kills both good and cancer cells. I don't tend to go into treatments, or I tend to stick with what's in the book, but please do look up any holistic treatments, besides, what's in the book, maybe like an alkaline diet, watch what you eat, things like that. Okay, that is pretty much it for chapter number 4. And you should have an exam coming up this week, at the end of the week, it'll be due. It'll cover materials from chapters 1 through 3. Make sure you go over and look over the exam review located within the Canvas page. Let me real quick stop share. Okay. Let me just give me 1 minute. Okay, so the exam review, if you go to your Canvas page where it says lecture notes, PowerPoints, exam reviews, looks like you had some reviews on campus too. They may have already passed. Click on this link here. Let's see, is it going to open? Go back down where it says exam reviews. So you got exam 1 review. Now I don't collect this. Basically, it just tells you what you will be asked for your exam. So you should be able to know these questions or answers to these questions to do well on your exam. So for like chapter 1, know the different organ systems, what organs belong to each system, what were the functions of the organ systems? Did you recognize any organs that may belong to more than one system? Know what homeostasis means. Be able to describe the difference versus positive versus negative feedback. Know the definition of a stimulus. So those are things you want to know to do well in the exam for chapter 1. Chapter 2, some of the terms that they want us to know: what's an ion, cation, anion, so forth. So you have questions here pertaining to what you should know for your first exam, covering materials from chapters 1 through 3. Look here, what are some things that will increase the speed of a reaction? Let me see: heat, presence of an enzyme, more reactants so you can form products faster, smaller size reactants as well. What is an enzyme? Well, enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions. What does denature mean? Well, when you apply too much heat to an enzyme, you break the covalent bonds, it unravels, the enzyme no longer works. How does temperature affect an enzyme? Well, a little bit of heat will make a reaction go faster, so it helps the enzyme, but too much heat will denature it. If it's cold instead of hot, well, that just slows the enzyme down. You don't necessarily denature it. And again, these things I went over in each chapter. If you need to re-listen to the videos. I'm done for today, and we'll see you in the next video.